Hello and welcome to my blog, vlog, whatever you want to call it. Today I'm not, rather than tell you a story, I'm going to talk again, to give another little talk about some of the aspects of story writing that I find interesting or helpful. The usual caveat applies. I'm not, the ultimate guru of all writing by any means. I just, having written 60 odd stories recently, have found some useful pointers. But today's talk is going to be about how to structure a short story, because like any piece of fiction, like any piece of work, your story needs a structure. It needs to be built upon a framework that will, carry the audience through from the beginning to the end, pay off certain things that are set up early on, and leave the audience feeling like, the end of a short story, you don't want to feel like you've just read an extract to a longer piece that's merely been sort of arbitrarily cut. So hopefully you'll get a feeling of closure of some sort at the end of it. So beginnings, let's start there, because that's a very sensible place to begin anything. My advice with this is, as with screenplay writing, in fact, is to get in late. Where does your story really, start off? Because you have a very limited amount of space to tell this story. So where's the latest you can begin it? What sort of preamble do you not require? And what do you absolutely need? A nice way to start is with what might sometimes is called a cold opener or a surprise beginning, where you start with something that seems fairly inexplicable or is very dramatic and powerful, and you sort of work back to how you got there. The most famous literary examples of this is in the Kafka short story Metamorphoses, where the character wakes up to find he's been transformed into a giant cockroach. Once you've read that first sentence, as Gregor Samsa, I believe, is the character, you have to read on. You have to know, what does this mean? What does this entail? In what sense? Is it metaphorical? Is it literal? And how's this going to play out? Is he the only one who's been transformed into a cockroach? So with a dramatic opening scene or image, you can sort of kickstart, it's like putting a pair of defibrillator paddles on your story, which is currently inert, and just jerking it into life, and suddenly it's going and breathing and alive. So that's a technique that works. It's not the only technique. You can have a slow build up, as long as you believe you're going to get somewhere exciting and the audience is going to come with you, and if it's beautifully written, that can happen. What you'll then be doing, obviously, is after that first scene, flashing back to some of the stuff that led up to that moment to fill in the missing bits. Because with a cold opener, you haven't given all the information. Very deliberately, you've withheld something. And now you'll be going back and filling in a little bit of that, enough to give the audience the clue as to how these characters got to where they are. One sort of cliched starter thing to open is characters waking up. It's really dull, and it's been done so many times in so many different variations. Do you really need to see your character wake up and start their day? Unless something extraordinary is happening whilst that's happening, or they're being woken by something extraordinary, an earthquake, aliens, the police knocking on the door, something like that. If there's something dramatic that's also occurring as they wake up, then yes. Or a surprise, they're waking up with someone they shouldn't, perhaps. But we don't need to know every detail of their day. And this sort of comes on to the next point, which is about exposition. You want to avoid overburdening a short story with exposition. You can use a lot more of it in a novel. There is time in a novel to sort of... Moby Dick does this in spades. You learn so much about the whaling industry, more than you ever wanted to. But it's fine, because it all adds to this sort of accretive detail that convinces you that world is real. Just a quick sip of tea. So I suppose the general rule is to show as little as you need, but as much as you require. that makes any sense. Find that balance. There are better ways than simply describing the background of a world, say. You can describe what's happening to a character, or, what their situation is through their behavior, which is ideal because, you're just an observer watching them go about their day, watching them interact. You can do it through dialogue. A character can tell somebody what's going on. That's quite common in crime fiction, obviously. Characters are always rushing into rooms and saying, "Oh my God, we've just decoded the flash drive, and you won't believe what's on there." There are always people filling in details that others have missed. And then the third way to do it is through what I'm going to call natural thought. In other words, sort of stream of consciousness. The passing thoughts that move, that you naturally fall into in the course of your day. So if you're doing a first-person narrative, that's going to be a very good technique to use, because you'll simply have someone describe, "Oh yeah, I've got to go down and get pick up the dry cleaning, but I'm going to avoid that street corner because I just can't face going past that again." And then quickly the audience clues into, they don't know everything, they know something's going on at that street corner that this person feels they have to avoid. But with exposition, as little as possible. If you really need to set up an unusual world to begin with, bang it out in a couple of paragraphs if you can, get onto the action. Perhaps start with a line of dialogue and then go into some expositionary paragraph to explain what the person's talking about. But it can just become burdensome to the reader in a short to have a wealth of detail presented all at once. You want to ease into it, really. There are genres, of course, that are very heavy in exposition, and there's not really any way around it, and that would be things like science fiction and fantasy, where you have to engage in a bit of world building, and historical fiction, where you're explaining details of a way of living that's past and people may not be familiar with, describing day-to-day life in ancient Rome, some of which people will be familiar with from watching movies and stuff, but other things they won't understand. There is a sort of exception to the undesirability rule of exposition, which is that if you're using an unreliable narrator unreliable narrator technique, especially in the form of a diary. So you have a character. I seem to remember from reading Adrian Mole, Sue Townsend books when I was young. Not much older than the character, actually. I seem to remember reading them about 15, 16. She uses that technique quite a lot. The character's talking about their day, explaining what's going on. But deep down, how that must have played out in reality and how different that must have been from what Adrian is describing. It's obviously a great example of this is, of course, in I've mentioned it before, but we need to talk about Gavin. The whole thing is predicated on the unreliable narrator, and she will tell you things that later do not really chime with things that you find out secondhand from other characters and from things that people say to her, and you sort of think, well, you gave us your interpretation of events, but did you give us what actually happened? How are we going to see that? You won't see it. It's from her perspective. Anyway, so avoid. I suppose comic writing is another possible exception. Joseph Heller does a lot of this. There's vast amounts of description, and especially character description in Catch-22. Whenever a new character appears, they're given 4 or 5 pages, and there's loads of repetition, and it sort of becomes a strange mantra-like kind of rhythm that you get into, where you're going to hear the same 3 or 4 things about the character again and again and again in different ways, and it's sort of the maddening repetition of it just mirrors the repetitions and the craziness in the rest of the book. But it's a very unusual technique, and generally, the least you can get away with telling people, the better. It makes the audience work a lot more, and they should be working. You don't really want, I don't know, maybe some readers want to everything to be handed to them, and they just sort of, act as a conduit, and it all comes in and out without much processing. But when I'm reading, I like to do a little bit of work to figure out what's going on, and what the environment is like, and who's who, and is that this person related to them, and oh right, okay, so that's their neighbour. And I like to do those little bits of connective thought. So I need space for that. So I don't want everything given to me all at once, just enough to sort of drip feed the audience so they keep listening or keep reading. Structure, well, you could say the world's most boring thing to say about structure, I'm going to say anyway, is that everything has 3 acts. That's really, it's not saying anything other than stories have a natural beginning, middle and end. Even if you tell a joke, you do the setup, 3 men enter there's a Scotsman, an Englishman, and an Irishman. I wouldn't go further than that because it's going to get very dodgy, but a horse, a cow and a chicken enter a bar. The barman says, "Why the long face?" And the chicken says, "Well, we just couldn't get rid of him. He followed us here." I don't know. So you have a setup, you have the little bit in the middle where the action takes place, the banter, the conflict, the plot develops, and then at the end you have the denouement, where it comes to a close. In short stories it can be a bit different. In novels you'll tend to tie things up quite a lot. In short stories you might leave it a little bit open, or you may just kind of draw the curtain across the action. But you'll still have a very concrete setup and then a development, and then you'll have something at the end, even if it's just an image or a phrase to end the story with, to leave the audience with something to take away from that experience of having read your short story. Because it's a strange, reading a short is it has to be a very economic use of time, because a novel does pay off the vast amount of time you put into reading it through complexity and development and surprise, and you have time to get to know those characters and to like or at least be interested in them. In a short story you're in and out, and you're not really, so the payoff for the audience is different. The payoff is either a twist in the end, or it's a deeper understanding of some character in a way that they haven't perhaps seen before or for a while. Or it's being moved emotionally, made to think. There's something, but there's not the same sort of complex payoff that would be required by that huge investment of time that's given to reading a novel. So it's a different sort of creature. So that's why the ending of short stories can be a little bit open, can be left a little bit as if the narrator has just decided to back away and leave it there. So the third act can be a little bit minimal. It can be a line, it can be a word, possibly. I don't know, maybe not a word, but it can be just as little as a line or an image. The second act does the bulk of the work. That's really the whole story, apart from the very setup. There will be conflict. It will play out throughout that second act, that bulk, the central part of the story. And in some way, something should be resolved in the third. Now, as with everything I'm saying, you can write something where there is no resolution for anyone. Nothing is resolved. Everything is sort of nihilistically the same as it was at the beginning. Nobody understands anything more than they did. Nobody discovers anything. Nothing is solved. I'm not sure how many stories like that people are going to want to read once they've read one or two. But by all means, try it as an experiment. Why not? Otherwise, I think you're going to find that two people have a conflict, there's a resolution near the end, or an understanding. If somebody has an inner conflict, and towards the end of the story they reframe that conflict in a way that explains the world to them better, or themselves to themselves. Conflict and resolution is, of course, key to all drama, and you will see it in a short. And if there's not a resolution to a particular thing, at the end, I would say the ending will at least confirm a standoff position. So it will, if you're positing that something might be resolved, the resolution is actually that it can't be. You still have a twist there. You still have the moment of hope where things might change, they might change, they're not going to change. I think Bernard Malamud's one of my favourite short story writers, and a lot of his stories can seem very tragically static in that the characters don't seem to learn or develop or change. But actually, there's always a moment in there where they could have. And that's sort of the tragic beat is, yeah, I'm going to do the right thing, I'm going to do the right, no, I'm going to follow the same pattern and fall off a cliff again. So read Bernard Malamud, he's excellent. He's a very underrated, well, he's not underrated in the sense that all scholars of American literature think he's incredible, but he's slightly forgotten in Britain, certainly, I would say. So where was I? Yes. Character revelation or plot revelation or a twist in the tale. Yes, that's what you're going to head towards. You're going to head towards, as I say, a character discovering something about themselves, something about a relationship with someone else. A plot's going to be resolved, and or possibly there might be a twist at the end where something the audience didn't see coming happens, or something they thought they understood in one way turns out to be in fact something else. Roald Dahl wrote many such short stories. Tales of the Unexpected, again another recommendation. A particularly funny one, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a sort of roguish antique dealer, a very unscrupulous antique dealer, goes to do a house clearance in this old lady's house. I can't remember why, but he decides to take her furniture as a job lot, and he's sort of doing a little survey of what there is and coming out with a price. And amongst all the tat and sort of fairly unimpressive pieces, he sees a Louis XIV dresser and is astonished. And clearly the woman doesn't know that this is what this piece of furniture is. So rather than reveal how amazing it is, he plays it down. He says, I suppose I can take that old dresser. And it's going to be quite hard to get on the... I can't fit it in the car. I could put it on the roof, but the legs are going to make it tough. Anyway, he downplays it. Something happens that means that he has to leave for a while, and he's going to come back later. When he comes back, the old woman has tried to be helpful. She has basically sawed the legs off the Louis XIV dresser, thus making it considerably less valuable in an attempt to be helpful. So that the little twist at the end is that and I suppose there's a moral there. So here's another thing about short stories. You can be quite moralistic in a way that in a novel might just seem a bit too pat. The character has their comeuppance in this story because their hubris and greed has led them to try and hoodwink an old lady, and her goodness, her essential innate goodness, has led her to defeat him. Pride comes before a fall, or karma will come and kick you in the head. I suppose that's the moral. Yeah. So those things are going to end your story. The resolution of a conflict between character, the resolution of a plot with an optional twist. Even a slice of life sort of style vignette will have some development within it. It has to. Otherwise, it's not really a story. It's more a scene or a piece of a character biog or something like that. If you're simply describing the characteristics of a thing or a place, that isn't really a story, I wouldn't say. You won't have time for B plots. I can't remember if I've ever read a short story that has a B plot. It's hard enough to tell one person's story, let alone the story of several characters who have different goals. So that's something you won't have to worry about. You can write from multiple perspectives. I suppose you could have a story where half is told from one perspective, from one character, and half is told from the other. That might be useful if you're writing a thing about, say, a failing marriage or an accident witnessed from several different angles, or two witnesses to a crime being interviewed by a police officer. Of course, it just doubles everything. It doubles the resolution. It doubles the necessary conflicts. It doubles the resolutions you're going to need, or something's going to be resolved, but it's going to come from two different angles. It's going to be more complicated, but I can't see any reason why you couldn't try that. So in terms of, if you were to get very specific about how much of your story is going to be devoted to setup, how much to development, and how much to denouement, for me it tends to work out, and I'm not saying this by any means that this is the way it has to be, but for me the first third tends to be the setup. 5/6 of it, I have too many sixths. That can't work. Let's think that through again. 2/6, 5/6, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 8/6. I've got this wrong. Right. Let's say 4/8. 1/2 is going to be, yeah, 2/6. 1/2 roughly, or maybe not as much as a half. A third, between a third and a half, is going to be the setup. The bulk of the story up to 5/6 is going to be the main part, and then 1/6, or maybe even an 1/8, is going to be the conclusion. So in percentages terms, yeah, let's not use 6 or 8s, because fractions, I don't do fractions well. So we're roughly talking 30%, 70%, and 10%. No, we're not. We're talking 30%, 65%, and 5%. There we go. That's 100. Right, I'm glad we got that sorted. Just as you got in late, you should try and get out quick. There's no need to have an endless sort of gloomy or slow fade out on a story. Get out on a line of dialogue. Get out on a moment. Shut that door as quickly as you can, and make it memorable, make it dramatic, make it beautiful, make it moving, make it funny. Any of those things. Leave a lasting image in the mind of the reader if you can. A moral if you must. Possibly a question. Leave them asking themselves something which is inspired by the story that you've told, because you haven't answered everything. You're not God. You're not going to dredge the depths of experience in this one tale, but it might beg a question. Or just stop. There's something to be said for literally just closing the curtain mid-sentence. No, well, maybe, who knows. Yeah, I mean, you could literally just have a character close the fridge door, end of story. I can't see that in a short story that's necessarily a bad thing, whereas in a novel it would seem a little bit unfair, I think. There's this kind of strange concept of fairness to the reader, to do with the investment of time and energy. And you can get away with a lot more in a short. You can piss people off with alacrity in a short that you might not be able to do so successfully, if you want a career, that is, in a novel. And enjoy it, enjoy the structuring process. If you're going to get anything out of this, I would say pare down the beginning, pare down the ending. Start there and then work on the middle. Once you've got that snappy beginning, that satisfyingly brief but dramatic ending, the rest is going to fall into place, I think. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on the structure of a short story. I could get more detailed, but it would seem unwise, because then I'd be prescribing things based on my own personal taste, and I do not wish to do that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. As ever with my channel, I would love it if you would subscribe, possibly watch a story. There might be another how-to video connected to this one. And I'll see you with a story in a couple of days' time. Thanks.